Welcome to the second day of Data3's JuiceIT. Today's session is about responding in the age of response, and we thought it would be an interesting chat to have because of the amount of cyber activity that we're seeing across the Australian landscape and globally across the world. I don't think you can pick up a paper and not read something about a cyber event happening somewhere. So joining me today, I've got Hayley Huppen, our Senior Legal Counsel, Logan Daly, an Enterprise Security Architect, and Richard Dornhart, our National Security Manager for Data3. So we put this panel together today because I asked a question in a session yesterday about how businesses could compete from a commercial point of view or from a technical point of view, given the threat that we're all facing. So I think starting with Logan or Richard, how would you answer that?
Can we compete?
I'm not sure.
Absolutely. How do we compete? That's the more complex question. And it is really about getting the right people involved. Now, I don't simply expect every company that's out there to be able to have all the resources on standby, ready to go at a moment's notice to be able to respond to an incident. But what I do expect of customers is possibly to have a plan in place. So how do we get to that plan? Well, it's a bit more of a winding road to get down, but the point is you have to start somewhere. And I'd usually start with a point assessment to say, where are we? What do we have? What do we not have? Where do we go from here?
Absolutely, and I think what's important, you mentioned basic things, and we have frameworks like the Essential 8 that highlight some of the basic protection controls that an organization can put in place to ensure that they are appropriately protected. You can't respond until you, one, know what you need to respond to. And part of that is understanding, what am I protecting? So oftentimes when I go in and talk to an organization about a response strategy or even a protection strategy, the first question I ask them is, where are your crown jewels? And that sounds obvious, but once I understand what I'm protecting, I can actually then start to build an appropriate response plan based on that information. So I know where to start.
Richard, you talked about what you need to do to start, but somebody has to start that, right? So where do you start? Hayley?
I think you have to start from the top. So there's got to be a drive from the highest levels of an organisation to make a commitment to security and to provide the resources or to make resources available to get organised, to respond, to know where your crown jewels are, to know what you're potentially responding to. So if you've got that commitment from the top, then you can build out a strategy.
I think that's what we're seeing with organisations that don't have security in place. It's really about commitment, right? You've got to start there first. For those organisations that are mature, that have the funds, that have all those building blocks in place, they've already started and they're further down the road to deal with it. But we are talking to the customers who are struggling with where to start and what to start with. So first commitment, then what?
I guess just going back a step too, if you don't have that buy-in from your executive, then there would be, a challenge there. So communication is very important. There's a lot of information out there on the risks that are available, and if you're someone in your organisation who's got concerns, then finding the right channels to communicate those concerns and get buy-in from people up the top would be a pretty important role for you.
So we're working off the premise that we, as a business, cannot compete economically or technically with some of these threat actors that are out there. So what we've got left is how we respond once we've set things up for ourselves, right? That's where we're going with this. How do you now prepare for that? Because I guess a good response is about being prepared to respond.
To be able to build that plan, you need to have gone through that process of assessing your assets and knowing what resources you've got available. So finding a framework of some sense that fits your organisation.
So I think one of the main things you need to start with is a current state assessment. What that is basically understanding what controls, what people, what process, what technology you have, what you don't have. So essentially you're trying to identify your gaps and overlaps. We're probably guilty of going out and buying too much technology. We have too many of this, we don't have enough of that. Nothing tends to work well together. So a current state assessment will figure out what you've got. I liken it to the box of Lego we had when we were children. We probably had all the pieces we needed to build something. We were always just convinced that we needed more of something else that didn't necessarily fit the bill. So the current state assessment will actually identify, okay, where's my risks? Where's my assets? Who's my people? What do I have? Where do I need to invest? Where can I save some money? Sometimes you actually have everything you need. It's just a process and a plan in place in order to be able to make it work for your organization. We talk about frameworks and standards quite frequently. ISO, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, COBIT. You know, the Australian Cybersecurity Center's Essential 8, or even the ISM as a whole, which consists of 772 controls. In theory, they're actually useless, but in practice, they're probably the best thing you can do to an organization by putting these things in and making them work for you. And once you've put them in, you need to continually test them. So cybersecurity is not linear, it's actually cyclical. It doesn't have a beginning and an end, it's a continuous process. Now, a good way to compare it is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. They paint it, right? What happens when they get to the other end of the bridge? They got to go back to the other end and start over again. And cybersecurity is much the same thing. It's a process.
And I think it's important, particularly when we're talking about responding, and as you said, Mike, there's going to be different levels of organizations attending this session today. But one of the fundamental components is actually having visibility of what's happening in your organization. You have to be able to see that something's happening so you can respond. And what we've seen recently is that the indicators of compromise are typically there, they're just not picked up. So in order to kind of kickstart that response process, you've got to make sure you've got the fundamental building blocks in place to know when to do it.
If you're preparing for a response, you can break it down into two areas, the technical side and the communication side, right? So in the technical side, we know the formula: assess it, contain it, remediate it. But for organizations that don't have the resources to do that, how do they go about it? So we've actually framed that if you want to be able to respond to something, at least prepare yourself, get yourself in a position, have some leadership, have a guide about the things that you need to think about. And then if you're dealing with an incident, assessing, containing, remediating, that takes specialist people, right? And it takes money. How do you go about that? How do you start to prepare yourself for that?
Your plan really needs to specify where you're going to turn when you need to seek that help. Who have you got internally that can help answer those questions? And if you can't have them answered internally, where do you go externally? A lot of companies might look to an insurance policy as a backup to assist if there is an incident. And most policies, or a lot of policies, will have a panel of experts available to the insured company, so that if an incident happens, there's a 1-800 number you can contact, and they'll put you in touch with a panel of providers who can help with your forensics, who can help with PR if you need it, who can help with just organising, coordinating your response. Because unless you are testing your plan as part of that preparedness phase, then it could possibly be murky waters for people.
If you don't have the resources to drive a particular standard, you have to look and see, what can I do to start improving my security posture. There are things out there like the Essential 8 that are essentially provide an organization with a very quick way to assess their maturity, but also bring in a level of controls to dramatically improve the overall security posture of the organization. And from a response perspective, what that starts to be able to do is it starts to dictate how we start to do things like apply certain patches in our organization. It'll say particular patches need to be applied within 48 hours or within a week's time. And so you start to be able to formulate a strategy based on something as simple as the Essential 8.
Richard, I think something you said there made me think about how a framework like that can also help you prioritising things, because you've said several times about how complex and difficult it is. And if you don't have a logical approach to it, then it can be very scattergun. And so I think as an organisation, you need to have that very clear thinking to make sure that you're prioritising what's important in the here and now, not getting distracted by all the things that are constantly thrown at us as new risks. Or you're evaluating risk, I guess, is something else that we need to talk about, but you're prioritising by evaluating risks as they present themselves and working out where they fit within that strategic program that you've got to approach security in the organisation.
So bringing it back and keeping this in context, the subject was about responding in the age of response. What we're talking about is preparing ourselves in case we have to respond. As an organisation, if you have to respond, there's a methodology, I think, around the technical response, around assess, contain and remediate, those three functions. Can you expand on that, Logan? Can you talk more to those areas at all?
Yeah, certainly. So I think you've summed it up quite well with those 3 points: assess, contain, and remediate. And of course, the assessment comes into play whenever you're trying to figure out exactly what's happened. And Richard touched on it quickly with the visibility. Having that visibility is crucial because we struggle right now. We've got too many layers. We've got a lack of integration between those layers. We've got a lack of visibility, and that inevitably leads to a lack of visibility or human error at the end of it. So once you've actually got the ability to visualize what's happening within your environment, then you actually have the ability to contain it. You might not be able to contain it within its entirety, but at least you can start making some progress towards an eventual resolution. So once you've got containment of a situation, then you could look into working towards remediating things. Sometimes it's something as basic as turning off a service, disconnecting something that might have allowed someone in, and then once you get past that, you need to do a bit of a cleanup, the bit of the forensics that come in at the end of it, and try to learn from that. What I find interesting is, Richard, you mentioned the Essential 8, and we're not in isolation by using the Essential 8, because if you look at the rest of the Five Eyes, if you look at New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, they all have similar processes. A lot of the same controls, such as application control, is actually part of that. So the nice thing is, while we might feel like we're in isolation, we actually have a very large global community we can draw upon for this knowledge and for this assistance. So from the whole point of identification, containment, and remediation, we should never be alone.
I think assess, contain, and remediate, I mean, they're great directional pillars, if you like, but not every organisation is going to have the resources to deal with those three elements of dealing with an incident or a security issue. How do they go about that? I mean, you need specialist people to assess it. You need knowledgeable people to be able to contain it and remediate it. And if an organisation is faced with that challenge, you know, what can they do?
Yeah, it's completely impossible to be prepared for every eventuality. It really comes down to odds and probabilities. Like when you talk disaster recovery, you know, Canadians might prepare for an ice storm or anything like that, but that's not really a problem here. So it comes down to what's your odds and probabilities. What we have really learned is the fact that the internet is no longer a nicety or a novelty, it's critical infrastructure. And the information that flows on that is critical infrastructure. I mean, you look at the last year alone, we've all switched to earning and learning remotely, and what that's demonstrated is that all our data is online, so that has to be protected.
So we talk about, you know, being prepared to respond. It's about knowing who can help you, right? Like who's out there, who's got those skills that can help you, both from a technical point of view and a communications point of view.
I think that starts in your preparedness phase, because you need to know who's there, so that if the worst happens, or even if, you know, the mild happens, because not every incident is a massive issue to deal with. Sometimes you're dealing with quite minor things. You know where to go to answer the questions. And Logan, that's something that I hear you say a lot: ask questions, ask questions. But knowing who to ask the questions of or where to find the answers is really important. So having some contact with authorities, with external advisors is always helpful. And then if you don't have a network there, an insurance policy is often a good place to start, because insurers will generally have a panel of experts at the ready to help an organisation who's insured, you know, answer questions in the event they need help. So insurance is definitely part of your preparedness strategy, and you want to consider whether it's something you want to have in place if you do need to respond.
Definitely.
And it's probably why I get a lot of these phone calls all the time to saying something has happened. It's a very, very reactive world. You know, we're pretty good at playing the I want to be prepared game, and we do spend an awful lot of time talking about preparing. We buy systems, we buy technology, we buy all these fancy shiny boxes with flashing lights. Well, what do they do at the end of the day? When something happens, and it's probably better to say if something happens, depending on what the probability is, you need to be able to handle that, be able to, you know, identify, contain, remediate. We keep coming back to those three central points. Now, I don't expect every customer to go out and spend $1 million on, you know, cybersecurity, insurance. They need to be able to identify what's your actual risk. So risk identification, which is probably going to be one of the first questions that's going to come up when you buy a cyber insurance policy. What are you trying to protect against? Do you want to have a policy in place to be able to provide you with resources in order to be able to contain and remediate? Are you simply looking to spend some extra money on perhaps putting some proactive technology in place? Because you know yourself, whenever you buy a vehicle, you don't just go out and buy an insurance policy. They are going to ask you a whole lot of questions. What kind of vehicle is it? What color is it? How many people are going to be staying in it? Where is it parked? Is it underground? Is it secure? How new is it? You know, when it comes to purchasing cyber insurance, it's the exact same conversation. They need to be able to identify what level of risk they're actually up against. And that consists of both the tangibles and intangibles. Now, cyber insurance is a little bit of a moving target when it comes to tangibles, because there's not a lot of them. It's pretty hard to identify a cyber risk assessment that's going to say, okay, reputational damage, what does that mean in a context of risk? What's that going to cost? You know, if they're saying, well, we need to be able to replace router switches, firewalls, that sort of thing, that's a quantifiable risk that actually has a finite number against it. You know, you can't really budget against, well, your customers want to go somewhere else because all of a sudden you've been compromised.
Haley, how do you work out in a particular scenario, that any thoughts on keeping everybody on message, because obviously there's lots of different pieces that you're trying to manage in a response. What are some of the risks or concerns there?
Having a central point to manage communication is really important, and having a clear message and keeping track of what messages have been sent is also really important, because you want to contain the rumour mill. You want to make sure that people who don't need to know about it aren't inventing what must be going on, I guess. You're going to have two streams of communication. There's commands and instructions that need to be given internally, and that needs to be really clear to make sure that people are following those commands the way you expect them to be followed, and that containment piece is happening using those internal resources. And then there might be third parties externally who need to know or might want to know, authorities, customers, who knows, but you've got that communication plan that you develop as part of your incident response needs to consider who those external parties are and what's the important piece that they need to know about whatever it is that's going on in an organisation. Microsoft, I guess, for example, FireEye, they do a good job of letting people know this is what's happened, but then focusing on here's what you need to do to protect yourselves now that you've got that information. And I think we're in a world where people accept that things happen. We need to work together to mitigate the risks for each other, and that's the basic premise of that external communication piece.
Well, I think you make some excellent points, Haley, around controlling the narrative, because controlling those channels of communication internally and externally are so crucial, because the slightest bit of misinformation will get picked up, it'll get magnified, it'll get twisted and contorted, and that's the last thing you want to do. What I would challenge anyone is to go out, look at their news site of choice, news.com.au, CNN, wouldn't really matter, and try to go through the entire site without finding some report of some cyber incident somewhere. It's just become headline news everywhere. And a lot of that comes down to a coordination of kind of those efforts. You coordinate the technical response, you coordinate the communications response. Rich and I have conversations all the time about how to coordinate those resources, both at a technical and administrative level.
I think it's a great point, Logan. And from my perspective, what I see a lot of customers do is they have a team, like they have I guess call it a response team, and that team needs to be close-knit. They need to understand how each other work, because when something does happen, and look, sometimes the response requirement is going to be as simple as making a change to a particular endpoint or something like that, and it doesn't require a full-fledged response. But in other times, you need to activate that team. They need to be able to come together. They need to understand what resources they have available. And they need to then have the authority to activate those resources. So once you've gone through that process, to do a post-mortem on that, right? Where were my gaps? So Logan, you talked about gaps in cybersecurity and technical controls. I think you have to do the same thing when you're looking at your incident response, is where were my gaps? And using incidents that maybe don't have the severity of a major incident are a great opportunity to do that. And it sounds obvious, right? We talk about testing, whether it's testing your backups, we're always talking about testing, but it's something I think that we just don't do enough of. And because this is, in the age that we're in today, it's definitely not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when and how severe that's going to be. So you need to make sure you go through those motions and then go back and review it.
I think if you look at any disaster recovery where you need business continuity, there are two pieces that really stand out: being organised and being able to communicate. They're just two pillars that always come together. And I think we're talking to customers, or the audience of this session, are those that haven't got the resources that other companies have and don't have the advancement in the way that they've matured their organisation, and we're trying to give tips, right? And we're dealing with an unprecedented event, really. Security hasn't just appeared, it's always been there, but it's raised itself to new levels. And I think our main message really is you need to be committed to the subject, assign some owners to it, prepare what you can, and set yourself up to be able to respond the best way that you can, depending on what happens to you. And that would be the same with everything, I guess, but particularly security and the complexity that security brings to the table.
You definitely have to have a response I'll call it a response ecosystem. Right, so you have to have that plan. You have to have, you have to have a team. You have to have a leadership team. You have to understand who you can access from a third-party perspective, and really, make sure you're bringing those people together on a regular basis. People understand their roles and responsibilities. They understand, well, what are we ultimately trying to protect, so we know where to go first, and because at the end of the day, this just comes down to appropriate levels of coordination and communication.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to think of the context of your business. What's the environment I do business with? What are my customers? What's my inputs and outputs? What's my desired end state? There really is no one-size-fits-all solution, and anybody that tells you otherwise is lying to you. So I would simply say, get the right people involved, ask the right questions, and just put it in the context of what's important to your business. Start with a conversation. Just start with a conversation. Pick up the phone and call somebody, even if it's just to bounce questions off them. Now, I tend to get the same 4-word questions over and over again. The first one is, how am I vulnerable? Because they want to know what could potentially happen to their environment, both from a technical and administrative thing. They want to know what could potentially happen to them. And the other one is, am I at risk? And the question to that universally is yes. But that's not a be-all and end-all. That's not a sky is falling type responses. Stop, relax, get the right people involved, ask the right questions. It all starts with a conversation, really.
Well, that wraps up our session today. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I'd like to thank our panelists for yet another unscripted session on a very complex subject called cybersecurity and responding in the age of response.
This can be a very complex topic, and we have a lot of experience helping organizations deal with response. So like I said, please take the opportunity to reach out.